Hello, I'm Anthony. Arturia have just released the latest in their Augmented series. This is Augmented Yangtze. The Augmented series is a set of plugins that combine real-world, authentic instruments, in this case Chinese traditional instruments, with a more synthesized sound. What we're going to do today is have a look at this synthesizer from the perspective of a single preset. I've chosen this preset called Ancient Qin, and I'm going to use this preset to demonstrate some of the features of the plugin. So without further ado, this is what it sounds like out of the box. And we can access that mix from the morph knob. If I turn this all the way to the left, you're going to get most of the traditional instruments and less synthesizer. And if I turn it to the right, vice versa. But can you tell there's still quite a lot of the original instrument in there, but you've got more of that kind of grainy pad sound. Let's have a very quick look behind the scenes to have a look at how that morph knob is configured. Your primary interface is your curated best of. Basically, each preset has a set of controls that Arturia think these are going to be the things that you're most interested in playing with. But if you press the advanced button, you get full control of the preset, and in the macros tab we can see that volume mix. So when we turn the morph knob all the way to the right hand side, this is why we're still hearing a lot of those traditional instruments. The sound engine construction in the Augmented series is split into two sets of two. We have layer A and layer B, and inside each layer we have two individual sound engines, parts 1 and 2. Layer A is currently responsible for the acoustic instruments, so if I turn these two values both down to 0, with the morph knob still all the way fully clockwise, this is basically the same control as in the main interface. Now the acoustic instruments have gone and we're just left with the synthesized sound. So this is a very quick example of how those mappings are configured. The front page gives you the kind of very friendly, easy to use feature set, but you've always got the option to jump into the advanced screen for fine level control of this stuff. We'll spend a little bit more time on the front end before we dive into fully understanding how this preset works. A couple of other brief examples of some of the controls around the outside. The motion knob allows us to introduce periodic time-based changes to the sound. So here's a note without any motion. It's very obvious what that's doing. We've clearly got some sort of tremolo because I can hear the volume going up and down. But there's something else going on there as well. Let's have a sneaky peek at the motion control to see if we can understand a little bit more. Sure enough, here's our tremolo controls. Both depth and rate are being increased, so the tremolo gets deeper but also faster as we turn the motion knob up. The other one, however, is going to have to wait till a little bit later. These function controls, this is function 2, doing some work on the synthesizer. We're not quite ready to understand how that works yet, but basically just take a mental note that function 2 is doing something. Back to the front page again, I'll just throw those changes away and get back to my basic preset. One final example before we dive into the meat of the plugin fully. I'll show you the color knob. If I turn that all the way anti-clockwise, we're going to get a fairly dull or frequency low sound. And as I turn it up, not only does it get brighter, but there's also a grittier nature to the sound. Where's that coming from? The advanced page will tell you. The color knob is mapped to several different destinations. A couple of them are probably slightly easier to understand. Filter cutoff is very traditional in synthesizers and typically brightens or dulls a sound. The other two controls take a little bit more understanding. These are frequency modulation and grain FX. These are basically selecting individual aspects of a sound and accentuating them. And in this particular case, both of these sounds are going to introduce a noise or a grit to the sound, and that's where that's coming from. So that's a very high level look at the plugin. From your very friendly interface with your 7 easy to access curated controls where the preset designer has thought these are the controls that you're most likely to want to change on a very regular basis, and the advanced pages where we get much greater control over the plugin. Let's start now having a look at exactly what that control looks like. If we start off on the Layers tab, these are your 4 sound engines split into 2 layers, and each layer has 2 parts, part 1 and 2 inside layer A. Each one of those 4 sounds can be muted. So if I mute 3 of them, now we're just going to listen to part 1. Part 1 currently has a sampler loaded, so we're going to hear an acoustic real sound. The peeper is like a traditional Chinese guitar. But every time I press a note, if I hold it for long enough, you can hear that pitch bend. Let's use this as an example to have a look at the modulation. Modulation simply means changing a sound. At the bottom of the plugin, you can see all of your modulation sources. And every time I press a key, if you watch Func 1, which stands for function 1, that pitch bend exactly corresponds with that curve that gets drawn. We're going to figure out how that works. Jump over to your modulation page, and you have tabs down the left-hand side where you can see low frequency oscillators, functions, random generators, and modulation sources that are mapped to keyboard controls. So we're interested in a function here because we know that function 1 is doing something to the pitch. And now that we're looking at the function, it's really obvious that that little blue ball that travels along the function is doing the job. We also know that at the moment we're only hearing sampler 1, everything else is muted. And so what you can see in this control down at the bottom is that mapping. The function is mapped into the sampler 1's fine pitch control as much as it possibly can be. Most modulation ranges on the Arturia go from -1 to +1, or many of them I should say. So here we have -1, which is as much modulation as the fine pitch control can impose. If I make that positive, the pitch is now going to go up every time I press a key. Let's turn it back down the way it was, and this time I'll edit the function, basically just clicking it a few times. Now I've just drawn a much more complex shape, and every time I press a key, the function draws a more complex pitch shape. So this is basically the difference between a function, which is a complex multi-point modulation source, and a low frequency oscillator, which is something that cycles periodically. At the moment you can see that it's drawing a sine wave. I'll throw those changes away, get back to my basic preset, and now let's have an example of the low frequency oscillator doing some work. At the moment you can see that it's not mapped to anything in the synth. You can see that both from the LFO page, where everything is marked as empty, but you can also see it down in the main interface because the LFO isn't blue. It's basically not highlighted. Let's map it to something. Jump back over to the layer, and for this demonstration I'm going to pick on a different sound. I'm going to pick on part 1 in layer B, so let's mute everything else. If I click at the top of the part name where it says synth 1, you can see that this is an analog synthesizer engine. It has 3 different oscillators generating different wave shapes, 2 triangle waves and a square. And you can hear that that pitch modulation is also being applied to this sound, and we saw that earlier. We were ignoring it at the time because we were concentrating on sampler 1, but this function is also mapped into synth 1. This is a good moment to kind of remind yourself about the terminology in augmented synthesizers. Every augmented preset has 2 layers. Those layers contain different parts, but those parts in turn can contain different sound engines. You always have 2 synthesizer engines, synth 1 and synth 2, and 2 sampler engines, and they're on layer A. So at the moment we're listening to synth 1, and that's why the pitch modulation is applying to Forest Spirits as well, because this is synth 1. Now I wanted to give you an example of the low frequency oscillator being used, didn't I? I'm going to map that low frequency oscillator to the pan setting for this Forest Spirits sound, and it's really easy to do that. You just click the little plus button above your pan control, and now everything on the bottom modulation row is highlighted. I simply increase LFO1. I've just mapped LFO1 to pan, and you can see it visibly. And if you're listening in stereo, that sound is now panning. Once you've applied your modulation, you can close the modulation window down, and that pan is now permanently assigned. Let's say we change our mind and we don't want to hear that pan. If I click in LFO, here it is, here's the assignment. And if I click X, I'm basically going to delete that assignment. So let's do that. So assigning modulation sources in these Arturia plugins is an absolute joy. It's incredibly easy. Let's have a listen to a different sound. What's going on in part 2 of layer A? This is another sampled sound, and it's a xiao, which is basically a wooden flute. It's a little bit quiet. I'll just turn that up a bit. Every one of the sound engines has an envelope. This is a good example of the envelope being used to slow the introduction of this sound. Every time I press a key, you can see it has an attack phase which introduces the sound slowly. If I make that attack even longer, now it's going to take a very long time to get all the way to maximum volume. Even with no attack, if I make that line vertical, that's a natural sound. That's the sound of a flute being played, and it has that gentle, gradual introduction anyway. So there are natural characteristics to the sound, and we enhance them using envelopes. Below the graphical illustration of the envelope, you can see manual control of each of its individual settings as well. If I bring the sustain up to maximum, it's going to play that sound at full volume as soon as it reaches its attack point. You hear the sound come back in. That's the swell from this particular sample. Let's say we want to overwrite that sample with a different sound. Click on where it says swell looped, and here's Augmented Yangtze's sample library. So down the left hand side we have the primary instrument types. Here's our xiao, and then we've got the different categories from which we can choose. So we can go for a staccato effect instead. It doesn't really matter how long I hold the key down. That's a staccato xiao being played. So that's what you're going to hear. The fourth sound in this preset is another synthesized sound, but this time we're using the Granular engine. Let's click on it to have a look at it. I think the fastest explanation I've ever been able to give of granular synthesis takes me about 5 minutes, so I'm not going to get into it. But basically we have lots of playheads that are going to strobe through this sample. If I play a key, see all of those black lines strobing across the sample. That's using a concept known as grains, and they're individual playheads that are playing back tiny portions of the sample according to all of these different settings, which is too much to go into today. But just remember, when we had a look at the macros page right at the beginning of this video, one of the modulation destinations for our color macro control was the synth-2 grain FX. And here's the grain FX control. So its default kind of resting position is 0.11, which is an amount of this value. But then when we turn the color knob up, we're getting more of this thing. If I do that manually, there's where a lot of that noise, remember I used the word grit, I think I did. It's effectively distortion because all of these different grains are being played back at different pitches. A good tip actually for Arturia products, but the Augmented series in particular, you have very good help for each of the controls. If you hover over the control down at the bottom of the plugin, you can see that this control modulates the pitch of the sample or grains in the modulator. We have many, many different playheads and they're all being slightly pitch shifted against each other. That's resulting in a noisy effect. So there's an awful lot to wrap your head around here. This is a very quick whistle-stop tour, but it's just a good introduction to basically different kind of lines of attack on this plugin to try to kind of understand how it all works together. Let's bring all 4 sounds back in, made lots of changes to it there, so we'll throw all of those changes away. For the final demonstration today, we're going to stretch our brains a little bit. Remember when we were having a look at the macro page, there were these 2 controls mapped into Funk 2, and I said, let's leave that alone for a while. Let's figure out what they're actually doing. Over on the modulation page, we can have a look at Funk 2, and it looks like a very uninteresting flat line. So how on earth can this possibly be having any effect on the synthesizer? Well, this is an example of scaling. You see this scale control, it's currently set to 0. Watch what happens when I turn up the control. That's the true view of the function. That's what's actually being drawn. If I bring that scale value back down to 0, all that's left behind as evidence that there's anything unusual here is 3 very small blue dots at the beginning, middle and end of the function. The scale control determines how much modulation is applied according to the function points, and with scale set to 0, the modulation is nothing. This helps us to make a little bit more sense of what's going on with that macro page, because if we have a look at the macro page, the function 2 scale is fully mapped. Remember, 1 is the maximum modulation that can possibly be applied. When we turn this motion control up, our scale changes. So let's figure out what function 2 is actually doing. Back over on the modulation page, it's mapped to 3 different destinations. We're panning one of the 4 engines. Layer A part 1 is being panned. The whole of layer B volume is being modulated, and layer B part 1 is being panned as well. So we're concentrating on listening out for changes to volume and pan, and we're also going to bear in mind that as we turn up the motion control, we're increasing the function 2 rate as well. In other words, this modulation is going to get faster. Let's see if we can catch it. Now, you might be able to identify the pan in that, but it's being obscured slightly by the fact that we also have tremolo. So let's temporarily mute the tremolo so that we can just hear what function 2 is doing all on its own. There, now it's really easy to hear that pan. Turn the motion back down again, and the pan goes away. We do have some slight volume modulation as well. Basically what's happening is, as the pan is being increased, we're just pulling down the volume of the sound a little bit so that it doesn't intrude too much on your brain. And so that's what the macro is doing. The motion macro is performing 4 different jobs, doing 4 different jobs simultaneously to save us having to apply modulation to the scale and increase the rate, do all of these things manually. The macro control allows us to do them all in one. Think of it like a container where you can do multiple different modulation jobs simultaneously with one easy to move control. I hope that's given you a good introduction to the Augmented Yangtze. Please hit like if you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. I'll see you next time. Thanks very much.